Welcome to another episode of Conduct Detrimental. Dan Lost, Dan Wallach. We are back. Dan, before we get started, a little bit of a programming note. Last time you and I were together on the podcast, Tua had suffered what we weren't sure was a concussion or not a concussion, whether he was in the protocol or not in the protocol. I think everyone now can agree that Tua has suffered at least one concussion, and that is what happened on Thursday night. So it's a story that, we'll spend a lot of time with today. We're going to bring on a guest, former NFL player, Rich Ohrnberger, to talk about the NFL concussion protocol, what went on with Tua. But the other story in, football lore, a name that people should know about, that's Marvin Powell, who passed away this past week, former player with the New York Jets. And Dan, you had on a very special guest, Jim Quinn, longtime friend of the show, who's been an advocate for player rights for many, many years, many decades. He used to work with once upon a time. So, this is an episode kind of at the heart of player advocacy, specifically on the football side. So a little bit of a setup for today, but Dan, I'll turn it over to you. What's going on in your world this past week before we kick it over to our guests?
Yeah, sure. I've been following the Florida sports betting compact appeal, which involves the Seminole Tribe of Florida's efforts to revive their online sports betting compact. It had been overturned last year in federal court because by allowing online sports betting, this compact exceeded the boundaries allowable under federal law, which is limited to gaming on Indian lands. So the Seminole Tribe is arguing that their exclusion from the lawsuit should be grounds for reversing the lower court's decision. And today or yesterday, the Department of the Interior filed an answer brief to the Seminole Tribe's opening brief, in which the tribe are claiming that the Department of the Interior could not proceed in defending the lawsuit without the Seminole Tribe included. It gets into the weeds of intervention, necessary and indispensable parties, sovereign immunity. I don't want to sort of get into the nuances of the legal issues, but we're getting closer to a resolution, at least in the federal court appeal. And I think all that really remains is the West Flagler, the parimutuel operator, filing their answer brief to the original appeal. That's due Thursday. And then the tribe and the government are going to get their last crack in a reply brief. And ultimately, this is going to be heading towards a showdown at oral argument, Washington, D.C., before the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And that's probably going to be the most important oral argument in sports law since the fall of the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, because that oral argument will decide the question of whether internet sports betting can be included in Indian compacts. And that's an issue that affects tribes nationally, not just in Florida. So that's one that is a gigantic issue in gaming law.
Yeah, sports employment issues, sports betting issues, and obviously the concussion issues. So we're kind of, as we say, Dan, we're at the hub of the sports law universe. So yeah, we love to put those cases on everyone's radar. Dan, it's funny. I think we'll start with your interview with Jim first, then we'll do my interview with Rich Ohrnberger second. But I will say, on just the NFL player rights front, I spoke to my class last night, spoke about a half an hour dedicated just to what was going on in football. And, for every kind of Colin Kaepernick type situation, or, there are certain situations that happen every, 5 or 6 years, maybe once or twice a decade. Jim is a fantastic guest because Jim is at the very heart of 3 or 4 of these instances, which I know you're going to get into, very big lawsuits that maybe our newer fans, our younger audience won't know. And then the other half of our episode, Dan, is dedicating to an ongoing watershed moment that the NFL is dealing with right now. You maybe thought they were getting out of the concussion controversy era, but what went on with Tua shows that, hey, you might have a policy on paper, but if it's not followed, which seems to be the case here, it's a completely other animal. So as we speak, the NFL and NFLPA are rewriting the concussion protocol. And, in the past, Jim has been at the very heart of these conversations, these narratives on the player safety issues. So, yeah, I think it's a wonderful lineup we've established today with Jim, maybe the godfather of, player advocacy issues. And then a player on the other side, Rich Ohrnberger, who's now a member of the media. So kind of really a double-edged sword for us. So,
and he's a fellow East Meadow High School graduate. I went to the same high school as Ohrnberger, and he and I were 6 years apart. So we probably know a lot of the same people in East Meadow, and I've never had the chance to meet him. So pass along greetings from a fellow East Meadow native. And, with Jim, it all comes back to why he's my favorite guest to have on the show. And I don't mean to exclude anyone else from the competition, but Jim has been fighting these battles on behalf of players going back to the late 1970s. He worked on the Oscar Robertson case. He's been at the heart of every significant NFL, NBA player free agency, litigation going back to the early 1980s, beginning with, I don't think he worked on the John Mackey case, but we're going to learn about the importance of the John Mackey case to NFL player rights. He worked on the Powell, Freeman McNeil, Reggie White, Oscar Robertson. This man has been part of sports law history for almost the entirety of my adult life, and he's still at the cutting edge of all these issues. He represented the city of Oakland, albeit not to the same level of success that he represented Freeman McNeil and Reggie White, but he's still one of the, along with Jeffrey Kessler, one of the go-to sports lawyers of not just the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, but also the 2010s and the 2020s. And he's fighting Major League Baseball, the New York Yankees right now on behalf of the Staten Island Yankees. And he's kicking ass and he's taking names. And he just wrote the most wonderful, it's probably been in print for a couple of years. And I've said this during the interview, it is the best, not only the best sports law book I've ever read in my life, it's the best sports book that I've ever had the pleasure of picking up. It is a true page turner. It is a compelling read. The book is called Don't Be Afraid to Win: How Free Agency Changed the Business of Sports, written by the person who changed the business of sports through his advocacy on behalf of NBA and NFL players. I implore you to spend $9 on Kindle or buy the hardcover or paperback. It's the best value you're going to get. You'll learn so much more from reading this book than any one course could ever teach you. Dan Lust's sports law course excluded, of course, but it is a must read for anybody who considers themselves a student of sports law or a student of the sports industry. It's the best thing I've ever picked up in my life. I can't stop reading it.
We have in my class, and I'm not opposed to assigning 2 books next semester, but we have the Darren Heitner How to Play the Game book. And now Jim is like a 4-time guest of the show. I think he's up there right with Darren in terms of repeat appearances on the podcast. So yeah, maybe we'll I'll make everyone buy that book next semester. But
he's in my book. He was the mentor of Jeff Kessler. We're talking about the George Washington of modern sports law. And this guy is still doing it. He's amazing.
Yeah. So, Dan, I think that's a good place to put a pin, in our conversation. We can kick it over to Jim Quinn. A reminder for those that are new, our podcast is sponsored by Themis Bar Review. The bar results are now coming back across the country. I'm seeing people pass in Illinois, New York, all over the place. Our own Taryn Sharma passed the bar using Themis Bar Review. We wanted to make sure I made note of that. So a big thank you to Themis and congrats to all of our listeners that passed the bar. And for those that are going to be taking the bar in the next couple of years, Themis Bar Review is the best place to do it. themisbar.com/condetrimental. And Dan, as we kick it over to Jim, I'm very excited to listen to your conversation as I have not heard it yet. And I will be listening along with all of our audience. And a big thank you if we don't say it. Each and every week, we look at all the numbers, and we are coming off of a very successful run, our most successful 4-month stretch from June, July, August, and September. Our numbers are very high in the nowadays, the tens of thousands. So I love seeing it. And a big thank you to everyone that continues to spread the word. If you are so kind, while you're listening to this episode, you can leave us a 5-star review. It certainly helps rise us in the ranks and continues to bring sports law to the masses. So without further ado, let's kick it over again to Jim Quinn, partner at Berg and Androphy.
Welcome back, everybody. It's my honor and privilege to bring back legendary sports lawyer Jim Quinn to Conduct Detrimental. Jim has been practicing in the area of sports, labor, and antitrust law for going on, I think, 5 decades now, and he's still deep in the mix on some of the major cases involving the sports industry. But I want to take a walk down memory lane here. And Jim's a partner currently at Berg and Androphy, a legendary head of litigation at Weil Gotshal. And a couple of days ago, Marvin Powell passed away. And first of all, welcome back to Conduct Detrimental. Jim, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thanks for being so generous with your time again.
Glad to be here. Looking forward to it.
I grew up in East Meadow. I used to play basketball next door to where Marvin Powell lived. I can't believe it's been nearly 40 years since Marvin Powell played for the New York Jets. He was 5-time Pro Bowler, one of the best players of his era. And he was also a labor leader who advocated on behalf of player rights. And having represented him during some of the lawsuits in the 1980s, can you illuminate the important role that Marvin played in leading to NFL free agency and the sacrifices that he made as a player to get the players to where they are today, reaping the benefits of all these multi-million-dollar contracts? What did he mean to the game and to your efforts?
And as you probably know, but maybe some of our listeners don't, Marvin became the head of the NFL Players Union in the mid 1980s, and in that position, he joined with the then executive director of the NFLPA, Gene Upshaw, both of whom were linemen, to begin to really fight for player rights and particularly for free agency, which had been introduced into both basketball and baseball previously, but the NFL owners had fought tooth and nail to avoid any form of free agency. And Marvin led that fight that began in the mid 1980s. In fact, one of the first lawsuits that we filed was the Marvin Powell lawsuit, which was filed in the district court in Minnesota, following on to an earlier lawsuit in the 70s that also had been played out in the Mackey lawsuit, which had been tried in Minnesota. And Marvin was critical as a leader to get the players behind the notion that the only way they were going to get true respect and money was to fight for free agency. And he was the lead plaintiff in the first lawsuit that we filed in the late 1980s.
What was that case about, Jim? I recall that it led to a district court victory before Judge David Doty, who to this day sits on the federal bench in the District of Minnesota at 92 years old, and he's
yes, he does
NFL cases throughout the decades. What was the Powell case about?
Well, basically, the Powell case was a challenge to what was then the reserve system that existed in the NFL. Particularly, they had a dual right of first refusal and compensation system that basically prevented players in the NFL from negotiating with more than their own team after their contract was up. So players basically were tied to their team unless they were released. And obviously, any good player was not going to be released. So it was a challenge to the very structure of the NFL system.
I quickly read through chapter 13 of your phenomenal book, Don't Be Afraid to Win, How Free Agency Changed the Business of Sports. And there's a chapter that's devoted to the famous Tex Schramm quote. I guess he said this in a conference room, that the players are just cattle and we're the ranchers. We can always get more cattle. What a horrific line to say. And that could only have emboldened your team. But what was the sort of the backdrop to that?
Well, I think this had during the negotiations in 1987, they were meeting in Philadelphia, and Marvin was there, and Gene Upshaw, and Doug Allen, who was a vice executive, and several other players, and they were debating the issue of free agency. And basically, it may have been in that meeting at one of the other meetings where Tex Schramm, in addition to his rancher comment, famously said, "Not in 5 years, not in 10 years, not in my lifetime will there ever be free agency in the NFL." Turned out Tex was wrong, but they were that adamant about fighting it. And that's how many of the owners back in the day viewed the players. They were just cattle.
Why was it important for Marvin to be the lead plaintiff? I mean, he was a prominent player. He was the head of the NFL Players Association. Why not have like line players or, backups? Why was it important that Marvin front this lawsuit? And what, if any, and we know that he paid a price for it. And I want you to talk about the ramifications that befell players of that era for being involved in these types of lawsuits against the league.
Well, I mean, one of the things we had found and you see it in the book and some of the other sports, that having a prominent player as a lead plaintiff was important because it showed the other players that they were willing to take the risk on their behalf. In basketball, for example, Oscar Robertson was the lead plaintiff in the Oscar Robertson antitrust lawsuit. And earlier in the NFL, John Mackey, the famous tight end for the Baltimore Colts, was the lead plaintiff in that earlier lawsuit. So having a very prominent player was important as to be the lead plaintiff. I think Marvin's, who was one of the best linemen in the NFL, found himself suddenly shunted aside shortly after that, and he was traded from the Jets, where he was perhaps, as I say, one of the best linemen and been an All-Pro lineman for 5 or 6 years in a row. Value suddenly went downhill after he was leading this fight.
I mean, patron saint Leon Hess basically blackballed Marvin Powell, and this was a guy, 5-time Pro Bowler in a 9-year career for the New York Jets. Basically saying that there is a fallout from his fronting this lawsuit, and he was released for that reason.
We certainly believe that. We didn't think it was coincidence that after this lawsuit was filed, within a year, Marvin was no longer a Jet.
In the run-up to this lawsuit, you were also suing the National Basketball Association. You make references in the book to the Mel Bridgman played for the Philadelphia Flyers, the Junior Bridgman lawsuit. He was that very top line forward for the Milwaukee Bucks. What was the line from Bridgman to Powell and the similarity and the strategies that led you to sort of use the Bridgman lawsuit as a blueprint for the Powell lawsuit?
Whether by accident or happenstance, it turned out that the collective bargaining agreements in both basketball and football had expired at the end of the 86-87 season. And so we had already in basketball obtained a certain level of free agency, but we were now seeking a broader free agency. By that time, there was a salary cap in basketball. We were trying to undo the salary cap. Never did happen. Thankfully, we never did undo it because it's turned out to be a bonus in basketball, but that's a story for another day. But we filed Bridgman first in New Jersey, and then I was contacted by the lawyers for the other lawyers for the NFLPA at the time, and the general counsel, Dick Bertelsen.
Richard, by the way, according to your book.
According to Richard, it's Richard. It'll always be Dick to me. And so we then began to coordinate the filing of the two lawsuits, and they moved in different ways over a period of time. We eventually settled the Bridgman lawsuit in 1988 after a threat of decertification of the union. The Powell case was successful at the district court level, and Judge Doty ruled in favor of the players. The NFL then appealed the Powell case to the Eighth Circuit, and the Eighth Circuit reversed Doty's decision, basically holding that as long as the NFL Players Union was a collective bargaining agent, essentially basically saying that as long as they were a union, they would lose their antitrust rights. That case ultimately led us, we appealed that to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court decided not to take a review at that time on that issue. They later reviewed it in the mid-90s in the case called Brown versus the NFL. But that was what led us to ultimately decide that we would disband the union and file yet another lawsuit in the wake of the Powell decision. And the case became known as the Freeman-McNeil case. That case actually went to trial in the early 1990s, and it was through that case that we were able to obtain. We won that case and were able to obtain free agency, which is the next chapter in the book. It talks about the relationship between the Powell case and the Freeman-McNeil case. Yeah, so without the Powell case, we would never have actually been able to achieve free agency.
All right, so the Powell case was the sort of the linchpin that led to decertification, which ultimately led to NFL free agency as the aftermath of McNeil, and was it the Reggie White case?
The Reggie White case, which followed on for the McNeil case. That was the club that we used. It was a class action. That was the club we used to get the NFL to agree to form a free agency.
You know what was really ironic about this, as I read it in your chapter 13 in the book, Don't Be Afraid to Win, How Free Agency Changed the Business of Sports. I keep repeating the title because I hadn't read it until today, Jim. It knocked my socks off. It was phenomenal. It is the single best sports book I've ever read in my life. And I've read so many of them, mainly biographies. It sort of made these concepts and historic battles. Understandable. It was a real page turn. I can't. I'm gonna read the rest of the book. It just blew me away. Where else do you get? You have to almost respect it in a Darth Vader evil shithead kind of way. NFL's attempt at turning player against player over these licensing deals.
Yes. Yeah, that was a whole nother fight that we had to fight through during the free agency fight with the NFL basically trying to take away the union's source of revenue, which was largely trading cards and other things that they basically tried to sign up all the top quarterbacks and have them sign directly with the NFL as opposed to the union and take away our ability to monetize the names and likenesses of some of the top players in the NFL.
I never heard the story of Boomer Esiason and Jeff Kessler almost coming to blows in a conference room. How close was that to true fisticuffs? That blew my mind.
I'm pretty sure that if Upshaw and Doug Allen hadn't stood up and eyes Boomer down, Jeffrey would have been pummeled to death.
That would be the last person any player should ever want to pummel. In fact, they should be sending him thank you cards. Send both of you thank you cards every day.
That's for sure.
Every day of the week for the rest of time. But as we get back to Marvin, and by the way, I was a little surprised to find out that the Powell case on appeal, it was reversed by a court in St. Louis. For those who've only come to the sports law world and are thinking of St. Louis, they think of St. Louis as like hostile territory to the National Football League. But back in 1987 or 1988, whenever that decision came out, the Eighth Circuit was situated in St. Louis, Missouri, or was that like a satellite court? It
moves around. They have the Eighth Circuit sits in St. Louis. They sometimes also sit in Minneapolis. They have really two different areas where they sit. It turned out that particular case was heard in St. Louis.
So what's Marvin's ultimate legacy? I mean, players today, they don't talk about Marvin Powell. I read all the articles in the aftermath of his passing, and they just sort of drop a footnote that he was former head of the National Football League Players Association. No one talks about his impact on the progression of free agency. Ultimately, what is Marvin Powell's legacy in the world of NFL labor relations?
He should be on the pantheon of John Mackey and Freeman McNeil and Gene Upshaw and Reggie White. Those were the key names that led to what we see today, where some quarterbacks are looking for $50 million a year. So without that group of players, from Mackey to Powell to McNeil to White, and with Upshaw's leadership, none of this would ever have happened.
Yeah, well, he may not be in the New York Jets Ring of Honor. He may not be in the NFL or Pro Football Hall of Fame. He should be on both counts. He's definitely in the Sports Law Hall of Fame. On a personal level, what was he like to work with in the conference room, strategizing? What was he like as a client and a person?
Well, first of all, he was a delightful man, a very nice man, but more importantly, he was very bright, very smart, understood very complicated legal issues, the interplay between the antitrust laws and the labor laws, which is one of the more complex areas of law, sports law in particular, but any law. And he had a good sense of what the issues were and was able to articulate them to players when we would have player meetings. And it was always important for, not only for Upshaw as the executive director, but also for a player who was still in the league to stand up in front of 150 or more players and articulate why we were fighting the way we were fighting.
So it shouldn't surprise you that he ended up going to law school and practicing law.
Not in the least. Not in the least. He ended up actually, as I remember, became a partner in a law firm out on the West Coast and did largely entertainment law.
Yeah, I read that, and I don't know. This just stuck with me. It was personal. I was a Giants fan in I still am. I mean, from the 70s all the way to the current day. But Marvin Powell was part of one of the great Jets teams in the early 80s that made the AFC, conference championship, had a couple of playoff runs. You had Joe Klecko, Mark Gastineau, Marty Lyons, Abdul Salam.
No, they had some good teams. They just could never get all the way.
No, and Powell was a central part of that offensive line. I mean, he was the building block of that offensive line. He was a pillar on the line. I mean, I don't think the Jets have had one other player in their history on the O-line that has made 5 Pro Bowls. And
Yeah, I think that I'm almost sure that's correct. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
no, he was a terrific player.
as we look back into some of the wars, and by the way, it must have been an incredible time in your life and in your practice to be in the middle of all these battles, the likes of which we haven't seen since the mid 90s. The 1980s was like a cauldron of sports litigation.
It was interesting times, Dan. It was interesting times. We had a lot of laughs, actually, and we often worked, as you know, closely with Jeff Kessler. I was his mentor for many years. And he and I, and also Bruce Meyer, who now is the number 2 at the Players Union in baseball. Together, we did things that we didn't even know exactly what we were doing, but we figured we'd give it a try, and turned out, at least for most of the time, it worked out.
Were your firms supportive of your efforts? Because you're taking on the Goliaths.
At that time, yeah, Jeffrey and Bruce and I were all at Weil, so it was only one firm at that time. But yes, Weil was very supportive, and remember, Weil had been the law firm that brought the very first antitrust lawsuit in basketball. So we were very familiar with the issues starting back in the early 1970s.
Is that the Oscar Robertson case?
That was the Oscar Robertson case, yeah.
Okay, before I let you go, I could keep you on. By the way, I want to turn Conduct Detrimental over to you and Jeff just to tell these stories, and we'd love to have you back to dive into some of the other areas. We just covered one sliver of one chapter in the best sports book I've read in my entire life. And if you're a sports attorney or someone interested in sports law, I don't just make these recommendations because I don't read too many books. I have the attention span for magazine articles and newspaper articles. This one is a page turner. I guarantee you this will be this will be well worth your time. Jim Quinn, you published this a couple of years ago. It's Don't Be Afraid to Win, How Free Agency Changed the Business of Sports. At 60 years old, I've read many sports books in my life. This is the best one I've ever read, and I'm only like 5% into the overall book. So I look forward to reading the rest of the chapters. But before I let you go, very unkind things to say about Ed Garvey's role in basically giving away the victory in the Mackey case and trading unfettered free agency for basically pension benefits. I didn't know anything about this. And can you sort of, help me and our audience understand how the players were on the precipice of unrestricted free agency in the mid 1970s, almost a half a century ago, and they gave it away?
In reflection, it's hard to understand, but you got to go back to that time, the mid 1970s. And Ed was a basic trade unionist. I mean, he believed in, I don't want to say communism, but he was more or less a Minnesota socialist. And he truly believed that players should all be treated, relatively equally, and that he didn't see free agency as being that big a deal. He thought that making sure that players got adequate pension benefits and health care was more important than free agency. What I think he missed was the notion that once you had free agency, all those other things were going to follow, but as night follows day, which is exactly what happened. But he misread the situation. Back in the mid 70s, I remember Larry Fleischer, who was then the head of the basketball union, and Marvin Miller, who was head of the baseball union, who I represented both at the time, kind of shaking their heads and saying, Ed doesn't get it. And as smart as he was, and he was one of the smartest guys that I dealt with in professional sports, he just had a different viewpoint, and he missed the trees for the forest.
Yeah. Are players too comfortable today with the average salaries, in the millions? They're still treated like cattle. The owners are still the cattle ranchers. The public inexplicably sort of sides reflexively with ownership because of how the media portray the greed of the players, even though the owners are billionaires. Now that the players' salaries have gotten to a level where they're set for life, is there ever going to be the appetite again for players to fight these battles, to have the next Powell, Freeman McNeil, and Reggie White case, and the next could be the current Jim Quinn, the current Jeff Kessler? Are these battles a relic or relegated to history, or is there still room for the players to try to advance further? Because they've given back a lot of the gains that you and Jeff won for them.
I think that the fact that there is so much money involved makes it more difficult I think the one area where if there is to be a fight, it will be over splitting the pie. You're really a function of how the revenues get split. The rest of it is more or less set in place. There's free agency to some greater or lesser degree in all four sports. And so players are allowed to move from team to team. There's some restrictions, but they're nothing like they were. And, I do think it's difficult. You could see that in the baseball situation most recently, where ultimately they led to a settlement because there's a lot of money involved, and you're going to if you actually go on strike, there is a lockout of a significant period of time. Many players are out millions and millions of dollars. It's time. You only have one chance to make this money, and for some of them, it's only one shot at one big contract, and as a result, there's an enormous amount of pressure to get a deal done.
Understood. And I don't think there'll ever be a time quite like the early 80s to the early 90s, where you basically changed the business of professional sports almost single-handedly with help from football players who put their names, reputations, and careers on the line to help their fellow players. And Marvin Powell definitely stands at the front of that line. Last question, Jim. You recently had a court decision in the Oakland Raiders case that led to a different result than what the city and county of St. Louis had achieved in the Missouri court system. Now we have inconsistent rulings, I guess, different authority on the same point. Are you considering taking that case to the U.S. Supreme Court on certiorari review, or is this the end of the Oakland Raiders relocation?
No, we did. We actually did to the Supreme Court, and yesterday the Supreme Court denied our request for cert. So I think it's probably pretty close to being the end of the road, and it's a bizarre circumstance that the city of Oakland is being treated completely differently than the city of St. Louis in the context of the Rams situation. But it's one of those things that happens in law. Hard to explain to a layperson why you could end up having a situation in Oakland, for example, that's completely different than the huge settlement that the NFL paid in the St. Louis case. Believe me, I'd rather have been representing the people in St. Louis.
Yeah, I think you would have taken that case to trial instead of, you're just settling for the life-changing Christmas bonuses that all those partners at those two law firms settled for. I think you definitely had more fire in the belly than the St. Louis trial counsel had. Moving on to maybe some other successes in your current, practice. You're representing the Staten Island Yankees. How is that case progressing against Major League Baseball and the New York Yankees over the sort of the contraction of minor league baseball? Where do things stand today with that?
We're moving through discovery. The Major League Baseball and the other defendants have, filed endless numbers of motions to dismiss and for arbitration and et cetera and so forth. But so far, we've won all those motions, including several appeals. So the case is going through discovery, and it will likely go to trial.
All right. Well, I wish you better luck there than you had in the City of Oakland case. You win some, you lose some, but you've won far more than you've lost, and you've impacted the sports industry in immeasurable ways. This is why you're one of the legendary lawyers in the history of sports law. You and Jeff Kessler, thank you so much for joining me on Conduct Detrimental. This was a delight to be able to talk to you again, and I want to have you back on. I want to do these like sports law history moments, all these important cases that really have not being taught in the schools, and just a fundamental history lesson about how your battles in the 1980s created what we're seeing today. The Bridgman case, Oscar Robertson. I could go on and on. Let's come back on and do this again.
I'd love to do it. I think one of the things that people who are interested in sports today want to know why there are certain things, like some of the rules that exist today, like the Larry Bird exception and so forth. There are actually stories to every one of them, and some of them are quite amusing.
All right. You and Jeff co-host the episode. Dan and I will recede into the background, and you just tell these stories?
Sure, absolutely. We'd love to do that.
All right. My pleasure. Consider it a deal. That's an oral binding contract. Jeff didn't agree to it, but you have the power to bind him. And
I have his proxy.
Okay, so there he is, Jim Quinn, longtime head of litigation at Wall Gotschall, currently partner at Berg and Androphy, and the author of the best sports book I've ever, not just sports law book, but the best sports book I've read in my entire 60 years on earth. Don't Be Afraid to Win: How Free Agency Changed the Business of Sports. Available on Amazon, hard copy, paperback, and Kindle if you don't have enough money to pay for the hardcover version. And Jim will personally autograph it if you ever see him in person. Maybe we'll do a book signing. Jim, thanks for joining me today. And thank you for sharing
Good talking.
your memories and perspective on what Marvin Powell meant to the game of football.
Absolutely. Take care.
So that was Jim Quinn, a partner at Berg and Drophy. For the remainder of this podcast, it's just going to be me, Dan Wallach. This is the nature of the beast when you have two Dans in two different time zones. We got to figure this thing out. So our next guest that's going to join us, we're going to talk exclusively really about the Tua situation, the NFL concussion protocol, is former NFL offensive lineman Rich Ohrnberger. He played with Tom Brady in New England for 3 years, played for the Arizona Cardinals, the San Diego Chargers. Rich has been pretty outspoken on social media about his concussion when he was a professional athlete. The guy played at Penn State. Just a really good all-around guy, and I've gotten to know Rich decently well from going on his show on San Diego Sports Radio. So when I saw Rich being pretty outspoken on the topic, I'm like, seems like a good guy to get on, and Rich certainly did not disappoint. Without further ado, let us kick it over to my conversation with Rich Ohrnberger. Rich Ohrnberger, welcome to Conduct Detrimental. How are you?
Very good. Very good to be on with you today, Dan.
So, Rich, I've already given your fun background to our audience. You are a professional football player, an alum of East Meadow High School, Penn State University. And then what do we want to say? You want to say New England Patriots? What do we want to say? That's your calling card in the NFL.
6 years, 3 different teams. I was with the Pats and drafted by them in 2009. Played a year with the Arizona Cardinals after playing for 3 seasons with the Patriots, and then finished up with the Chargers for 2 years. And that was when they were still in San Diego. And when I moved to San Diego, I realized, this is pretty good. I'm not going anywhere. So I've been here since.
Rich, I guess behind the scenes, I go on your San Diego radio show with our mutual friend, Ben Fletcher, all the time. And it's a long time in the making for you and I to talk independently of Ben as our broker. So now you and I get to talk directly.
That's right. Yeah. We finally squeezed out the middleman.
Get rid of Ben. Get rid of Ben and his golf show. We don't need him for this. So, Rich, I saw a tweet that you had about a week ago with respect to the Tua situation. I thought you'd be a really good person to have on the show as someone that is seemingly very outspoken on this concussion issue, someone that I think has had some personal experiences with it. And obviously, as a football player, you're, through high school and college and at a high level in the pros, you've been around other players suffering it. So I'm going to give you the floor to start. I think our listeners know kind of where I stand with the concussion protocol, but I wanted you to have the platform first just to give your overarching thoughts, and then we'll kind of unpack what we do with this Tua situation now in 2022.
Yeah, it's such an interesting case, right? Because we've seen many, 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 many concussions in the NFL. It's part of the game. It's a sport that inherently you take on a risk of head trauma if you're going to play football at any position, even as a kicker. I mean, it's not completely outside the scope of possibility that you kick the ball off on a kickoff, you go down, try to make a tackle, you catch a knee to your helmet, and you're concussed. A punter. How many times have we seen players run into punters, or a punter trying to make a tackle on coverage? And you know what? Sometimes you catch a knee to the helmet, or you hit a guy head to head, and there's a concussion. So legitimately every single player who enters the field of play off the sideline has an opportunity to incur an injury, a traumatic brain injury. And what we saw that was so unique Thursday night was the proximity to what was, in my opinion, so obviously a concussion when the Miami Dolphins took on the Buffalo Bills on Sunday afternoon, where Tua got up after being taken down, getting a pass off. He banged the back of his head on the field, got to his feet, and lost motor function to his lower body, and kind of had to be helped back to his feet by some of his teammates. And then to play 4 days later in a Thursday night football game, and to ultimately have his day ended by getting another concussion, is where this story diverges from so many we've seen before.
Let's pause there for a second. You said something which I imagine, I would hope NFL players know this, but it seems that Twitter needed an education on it. And maybe the Miami Dolphins did with some of their PR stuff. So Rich, my background before going to law school, I worked for the New York Giants in their PR department. So you had to be a little bit careful about what you said, right? I was there during the Plexico Burst foot shooting incident. So, there's some high profile things. You got to be very careful about what you say in the media, right? So, there's a guy, Mike McDaniel, who is seemingly a coach with a very bright future ahead. He's had some maybe ill-advised comments, right? This is just as severe a concussion, right? There were comments coming out of the Miami organization or whoever it was saying, no, it wasn't a head injury. It was a back and an ankle injury. So, to me, I'm the attorney, right? You guys can trust me. I read the pertinent provisions of the concussion protocol. You said the term there, right? It was very clear that Tua was compromised in some way, shape, or form, whatever you want to call it. In our legal world, we would say like causation. I don't know what caused Tua's legs to crumble. I don't, but I do know that that's seemingly some type of neurological deficiency. I don't know what it's causing it. Maybe it's the ankle, maybe it's the lower spine, maybe it's the middle of his back, thoracic spine, lumbar spine. I don't know what it was, but the concussion protocol in 2022 is clear that a spotter, if they see that you have some type of issue, they'll flag it and you'll be taken off the sidelines and you'll have to speak to the team doctor and this neuro consultant who doesn't necessarily have to be a doctor. But in order to get back on the field, you have to demonstrate that you're not neurologically compromised. So what I haven't said is that you don't have to disprove that you have a head injury. You have to show that you're able, right? And you're fully okay to be on the field, that you don't have any leg crumpling issues. So that was my concern, that there was this narrative that the Dolphins put out, which I'm sure it was them. No, it was a back and an ankle injury. It doesn't really matter what it was. It matters what we saw on film. You don't have to be a doctor or a lawyer or even a former player to understand that something very wrong is happening when your legs are crumpling. So I don't know. I'll give it to you. Didn't you see what I saw? Isn't it just so obvious to everybody?
Yeah, again, that's my opinion and not an opinion of a medical doctor. I've never practiced, but I've had a concussion in the past, and I've had a concussion multiple concussions that were paired with similar neurological symptoms. And so to me, it was, again, in my opinion, very obvious what he was suffering from, especially after seeing the way his head contacted the ground, which is so different than when your head contacts a player, even the back of your head, because you don't realize it. But in space, with two players who are not grounded, 100% with the give of, the player who's making contact with you and your neck and his neck and all of that. That's a reduction in energy. The problem when you hit the back of your head against the ground doesn't move. So the only thing that's left to move is your brain inside your skull. And so what happens essentially is your brain is in a liquid sack. And if your head is moving fast enough and it slams against an immovable object, the brain is going to decelerate rapidly and then contact the inside of your skull. And that obviously leaves a bruise of some sort to tissue. And that's what causes a concussion, right? We should all know that by now, but many people seem ill-informed, or maybe even, just because they're uninitiated. It's never been a part of their life. But as an athlete in a contact sport, and one where concussion is so prevalent, it's something that every player is aware of. And again, like I said, it's my opinion that he suffered a concussion, and that was the chief reason why his legs gave out on him. It just seemed like very obvious. So look, I don't know what's going to happen to the Dolphins. There's an old saying, the cover-up's worse than the crime, right? And I hope that's not the case here. I hope that they weren't lying in order to cover up anything, right? Maybe they have it right. Maybe Tua was suffering from severe and acute back injury that was giving him neurological symptoms down his legs. Like you said, the lumbar spine can sometimes cause nerves to even blank out, and you could have temporary paralysis from a lumbar spine injury, so there's that too, but again, my sincere hope is that they did everything in their power to protect the player. We'll find out because there is an ongoing investigation.
Rich, this is why I know you're a pro. You took us exactly where we needed to go, right? This is the other end of the equation, right? So people that are listening to this, obviously they're in the middle of this investigation. They already fired the independent neuro consultant. We did our research in the concussion protocol. to the extent the Dolphins, we'll say wrongfully influenced Tua for some, I think the term was for competitive purposes, there could be very large fines, the forfeiture of draft picks, something like we've never seen in that sense. But, this is a podcast, and I'm the first to admit it. I am on the side of team rights versus player rights. Just my head always goes to the player side of it. I wasn't good enough to play at a good school like Penn State or anything like that, or play in the pros, but that's where my mind goes. And, but I always have to call it like I see it on both sides. Tua, right? There's certainly a scenario in this where Tua has some culpability that, as a professional athlete and a guy, and we all know Tua's situation, he was kind of, there's always second fiddle with the Dolphins. They tried to get Watson. They brought in Fitzpatrick. Here's a guy that's coming off that huge game with the Ravens, and now he's finally playing the Bills in a huge game, a division rival. Like, yeah, that guy doesn't want to get taken out of the game. That's not so shocking. So, there's certainly a world, and I don't want to speculate, but that's part of the investigation, what Tua said. Rich, the reason I wanted to have you on this particular show is for this topic. This is the tweet that you sent out that, went viral at Rich's. You go viral like every other week now. I don't really know how you do it, but I'm just going to read this for our listeners. This was you just said, very thankful today for the Patriots trainers / medical staff for the way they handled my concussion in 2011. I was out on my feet. They took it seriously, and I spent the year on IR. They saved me from myself. I would have rushed it back if they let me. They didn't. Prayers for Tua. So I'll let you go ahead and give the context to that story. I think it's very important.
Yeah, back in 2011, and to lend context to that part of the story, 2011 was where the Concussion movie was released. And all of a sudden, there was a heightened importance on not only for players post-career, but current players to take the issue of concussion and CTE, which was a discovery that had very recently been made, way more seriously than ever before in league history. And so protocols were changing almost daily. Certainly annually as the seasons went on, and I played in that window from 2009 where there were very few concussion protocols in place through 2014 where there were very many concussion protocols in place. So I saw a complete reversal of the level of seriousness and care that NFL teams, doctors, trainers, etc., players treated these head traumas with. So that's a little context there. And then, my incident occurred the final game of preseason. I was out there. I started the game with the first group there, and we were going against the Giants, and I went head to head with a linebacker, and it broke my face mask. And I was, like I said in the tweet, I was out on my feet. And when my vision returned, I couldn't tell you what I looked like staggering around out there or otherwise, but when my vision returned from black, I was still standing and I had fireworks going off in the periphery of my vision. And it was difficult at first to keep my balance. I kind of felt like I was walking straight, but I was probably like diverging off the path and all that. And then after a few seconds, like where I was legitimately considering leaving the field because I was like, whoa, am I even able to play right now? I got back into the huddle and I was able to finish the drive. But the symptoms actually worsened. Now, they weren't as acute as having that momentary blindness or that, that loss of vision, but I started having severe memory problems to the point where, Tom would make the play call in the huddle, and then I would get to line of scrimmage. I would be tapping the center. At the time, it was Dan Copen, and I would be like, "Hey, what's the play? What's the play? Where are we going? Who do I block?" Like, just shouting at him. And he was directing traffic for me. And then very shortly after that, the starters came off the field, and then I was the backup center, so I switched to playing center with the second team, and so I went into the game and was having the same issues with my memory. The quarterback would say the play, I would get to line of scrimmage, completely forget the play. And it just kept happening. And it wasn't getting any better. And finally, one of my teammates, I don't exactly remember who it was, but one of my offensive line guys goes, "Dude, if you can't remember the play out of the huddle, you got to get out of here." And so that's what happened. I reported myself to the trainers, and I didn't even have to tell them that I can't play. They basically from there took me off the field, brought me inside, and my day was over. And that was just the beginning of it, because what inevitably happened is I ended up on the season-ending injury list. It took a long time months to recover from the symptoms of the concussion. On the other side of all of it, I'm very fortunate that I was able to continue my playing career. And I know for a fact that if I hadn't been put on the IR, I would have definitely tried to get back out there as quickly as humanly possible, because you're a competitor. And when you're a competitor, you want to compete. And football is a sport where you learn to completely disobey your body's desire to protect itself. You're hot wiring the system. One of the most important things every football player's got to learn at a young age, or whenever you start playing football, is not to flinch when you hit somebody, not to look away from contact, but to keep your eyes open through contact, to make sure you see it through. So that's like day one stuff, learning how to play the game. You have to embrace the violence. So yeah, with that, I know for a fact if they didn't handle it the way they did, I would have fought my way back on the field. And I don't know what the end result of that would have been, whether it would have been benefit or a deterrent to my career. But, as a result of it in my post career, I look back on it now and I'm very thankful, because obviously, my goal now is to live as long and as healthily as I possibly can. And at that time, my goal was to just be the best football player and to help my team as best I could.
Yeah. And I think, just going back to comparing the two situations, yours and Tua's, not to say that, again, we're not going to know what was going on behind closed doors in the Miami game, but this system is put in place, which I kind of glossed over it, but you have your team doctor and you do have an independent, neurologist, neuroconsultant, whatever you want to call it. But, I've worked against teams on my legal side. I've worked for the New York Giants once upon a time. And there's this dichotomy with the doctor, right? The doctor owes you, a team doctor, this, patient, physician-patient relationship. They owe you a duty to do the right thing. But at least in these sports circles, there's a lot of literature on how sports doctors kind of have like two masters, right? You owe a duty to your patient, but you're also you're on the books of of the particular team. So that's why this, the independent doctor is supposed to be brought in to, I guess, help the team doctor along and make sure that everyone's on the same page. So what I found to be pretty alarming, at least, Rich, before we get there, your situation is a good one, right? Everybody flagged it. Everyone did the right thing, and maybe, right? I don't know the answer to this, but if that same exact thing had happened to Tom Brady, maybe there would have been more pressure to keep him on the field, right? Maybe it was just different given your status with the team, but it shouldn't be the case, right? There's those funny memes that go around, like, there's like 8 skeletons and one says like black, white, Asian, this one. It's like, we're all the same on the inside. So it shouldn't matter what position on the field you play, offensive tackle or quarterback. But, a guy like Tua is under a magnifying glass. And, maybe there was more pressure on the Dolphins doctor and on the neuroconsultant than there would be for another player, right? I know this past week, 6 players entered the concussion protocol across the NFL. I can't name a single one. I don't know who that was. And I'm sure if there was a quarterback, I'm sure we would have known that immediately. That's the nature of the beast. And, as someone that, I guess you went through the protocol, did you have to get evaluated by a team doctor, by an independent doctor in that process?
The word independent, to your point, is really tricky, because that doctor is paid by the league and the NFLPA, and there's a lot of motivation for star players to stay on the field. And there's no question, whatever you think about his ability as a quarterback, and I'm talking to anybody listening to this, Tua is a star. He plays for a Miami Dolphins team that has a real chance of doing some special teams this season. He's one of only 32 guys who get an opportunity to lead an NFL team on the planet. Like, there's only 32 of these spots, and you could make an argument that he's probably in the top 20 conversation, if not higher than that. So this is one of the best guys on the planet doing what he does. And so if you want to talk about pressure to have somebody who aids and benefits the entire machine of the NFL to be back on the field as soon as possible, whether it's a health issue or otherwise, yeah, I would say there's pressure there. And also it's not lost on me that, a linebacker, an offensive lineman, or a defensive lineman, or, running back, you're playing a very different position than a quarterback. How often a quarterback gets hit is oftentimes determined by the quarterback. Like, are you going to stay in bounds, or are you going to, kind of on that scramble drill, you're going to lean back into contact? Are you going to slide, or are you going to go head first? Is your offensive coordinator going to call your number for a planned QB run play? The only times where you really are at the mercy of the moment in terms of taking on contact is when it's unexpected. And unfortunately for Tua, and the decision, whether it was him or if there was pressure on him to return to the field sooner than maybe medically advantageous, was that lightning struck twice. So that's again the unique divergence of this moment in NFL injury history as compared to so many concussions we've seen in the past, was just the fact that not only was he injured and rushed back to play with an apparent concussion against the Bills and a diagnosed concussion against Cincinnati Bengals, but it was the proximity in time where it took place, and the fact that both of the hits to the back of the head off the ground looked so similar, and the fact that both times there were neurological symptoms following the concussion that were caught on camera. That's the biggest part about this. If they never caught Tua staggering around and it was just some print writer who caught it and put it in a story, this would not have gotten the type of media attention that it did. But both times, him wobbling on his feet after the Bills game, or after the hit in the Bills game, and the fact that he had that fencing reaction, that clenched finger reaction that was caught on camera and replayed by Amazon so many times over on the field against Cincinnati, is one of the biggest parts of this story. Because had that not happened, I don't think you and I are doing this podcast today.
And on that, there is something interesting to that. You said it was replayed on Amazon over and over. There's probably someone at NFL HQ was like, why do they keep replaying that? That doesn't look good for us, right? So, this is a topic we've covered in the past and that I've covered in my personal practice, but like the NFL had at one point they said, we want to be tough on COVID, right? We do contact tracing. If you were within the vicinity of someone that tested positive for COVID, you were off the field, no exceptions. You could be Brady, you could be all three of the Denver Broncos quarterbacks, doesn't matter, you're going to start a wide receiver, right? They're very strict at that. But then all of a sudden, right, when the playoffs came, like miraculously, people stopped testing positive for COVID. It was like the weirdest thing. I'm like, I guess the NFL cured COVID. It was very strange. But here's the thing, right? The NFL has to make a decision, and that's what they're doing right now. The NFL and the NFLPA are speaking, and they have to figure out how objective they want to be with this criterion. I was listening to the ESPN Daily podcast. Alex Smith was on it a couple of days ago, speaking about the old protocol, and I'm not sure how different it is when he played versus now, but he knew the answers to the questions. He was already pre-prepared for what they could ask him to be able to get back to the field, and he was competing against Colin Kaepernick in a quarterback battle, and then later with Pat Mahomes. So he wanted to play, but the question is, does the protocol need to be designed to take the human element away from it, to take a guy like Tua, hey, was it your neck or was it your back or your ankle? Like, get those questions out of the policy. So, the NFL, again, they were very, I think, objective with COVID until it was inconvenient for them and the playoffs started. And, we'll see. There's certainly a way to make a very objective concussion protocol that maybe a guy can't pass. It was a very, I covered it a lot during baseball. Mike Trout tested positive for COVID, and it took a while for the COVID, I think, to leave his system. For whatever reason, everyone's bodies were different, and baseball had to feel comfortable with a guy like Mike Trout not being on the field, and they just had to be comfortable doing it. So, but they created some objective criterion, and I think what we've seen is that the NFL and NFLPA, maybe they created a concussion protocol that was designed to get rid of human element. But if you're going to fire this independent neuro consultant within like 3 days, and you put out the press release that he made several mistakes, that means that there is human element that's factored in here. So I don't know, Rich, what do you think about the future of the protocol as we move forward?
Well, I think it's really bright to bring up the fact the COVID protocols shifted in the postseason for the NFL, and the importance of getting those games played on time, on schedule, and having as few players in COVID protocol during that very important earning window in terms of revenue and viewership for the NFL, probably, in my opinion, took precedent over player health. And you could argue that players would agree with that determination, that decision being made at that time. Because as a player who, as my career advanced, more and more, I became aware that, hey, maybe there are more yesterdays logged than tomorrow's ahead. And it's getting pretty important for me to try to win a Super Bowl here if that's something that I'm interested in doing. So those playoff moments, you understand how fleeting they are. And so I bet you, if you polled the players and asked them, hey, are you okay with these new improved COVID protocols for the playoffs? I bet you would have almost 100% or a lion's share majority in favor of it. And that's kind of the thing. Like you said, when subjectivity is introduced and we're no longer treating a player health situation objectively, well, then of course there are workarounds and loopholes that can be exploited. And so with the COVID protocols, they switched from testing however often to only if you're symptomatic. I believe that was what was going on. Well, symptoms are subjective. Like, I mean, let's face it.
Just like concussion symptoms could be.
Exactly. So when exactly do you report that you have a runny nose? Is it a runny nose or is it a cough? Is it a bad enough cough to report? Yeah, so that's where this gets really fuzzy. And with these COVID protocols, look, here's what I know, and here's the best comparison I can make. Two other sports that obviously deal with concussion and brain trauma consistently: the UFC and boxing. You're in a ring, you're in an octagon, there's a ref, he's up close, there's only two participants, so his job is way easier as the objective, or as objective as he could, impartial judge of who can go on in a situation where maybe there's some sort of cognitive disorganization happening where a player or a participant can no longer protect himself, right? And his job is to dive in there and wave his hand as soon as he sees it, as soon as he spots it. But look, again, a ref is right there next to the fighters. He's right there next to the boxers. He can grab their mitts and see if he's getting any, response from limbs, or are they going limp on him. He can see it up close in person. If it looks like cognitive impairment that's leading to a loss of balance, or did a guy just slip on some sweat or blood in the ring? So it's easier, but somebody's there to wave the hand. Nobody was there to wave the hand for Tua. And we had a close-up video shot. There was evidence. There was evidence that he was impaired in some way. And if that was a boxing match, whether or not it is 100% because he took a shot to the head, or if it was a neurological symptom of a lumbar spine issue, say, the fight would be called. It doesn't matter because he can't protect himself. And I think that is the difference in these sports where head trauma is so consistently portrayed and participants are protected against. And the NFL, if you have evidence, there probably needs to be somebody who's legislated to walk in there and say, okay, fight's over. Don't care if it's back, knee, ankle, because it looks like head trauma. So we're just gonna call this one off, and then we're gonna go reevaluate later.
That is a great point, and I think probably a good place to end this conversation is to see, what the NFL wants to include. I watch basically every UFC fight. I watch a lot of boxing fights. If you can't get to your feet in 10 seconds, fight's over. Tua could not stand without the help of his other players. UFC, I watch it. If you go out for a split second, your eyes roll the back of the fight is over. There's no period of recovery. They don't give you 5-10 minutes. It's over. And that's because they're protecting their players. So, we'll see. Rich, if they want to call you and I to consult on what would be objective issues, I'm sure these two ideas are on the table right now, but it is what it is. But, Rich, I did mention you before we started. Dan Wallach couldn't join us today, but he is a fellow alumni of East Meadow High School in Long Island, New York. As I'm recording this, I'm in Garden City, Long Island, for my new law firm over here. So we got a bunch of Long Island connections. Now, Dan has asked me, I have two questions for you. You ready for this?
Yeah.
Dan has asked what your favorite pizza place is amongst these three competitors: Pietro's, Pizza King, or Borelli's. Apparently, there is one correct answer.
I went to high school with some of the Borellis, so they'll probably kill me and hate me for this, but I grew up a Pietro's guy. We went down the block. They had the sesame seed crust, and So of those three, I'm going Pietro's.
I cannot confirm or deny if that's the correct answer. Wallach will have to confirm that. My last one for you, Dan was like, "Wow, Rich is a Rich from East Meadow High School. How crazy is that?" Because the only other NFL player that I know that went to East Meadow is also named Rich. Rich Maudie. So I know you're obviously familiar with the rich history of riches at East Meadow High School. Listen, all personal bias aside, who do you prefer here, Rich Ohrnberger or Rich Maudie?
Oh, come on. There's no question. Rich Ohrnberger. No, I will. Rich Maudie was an insane talent. Never saw him play. I believe he played in the 70s, but he graduated from East Meadow High School, went to Nassau Community College. And oddly, I played at Penn State in the early 2000s. He played at Penn State either in the late 70s or 80s. And he was coached by Joe Paterno, and I was coached by Joe Paterno. As a matter of fact, when I was in school there, I played with both of his sons, Patrick Maudie and Matt Maudie. So yeah, me and the Maudie family overlapped several times over the course of our playing careers and lives. But yeah, it's very interesting that the only two, at least to my knowledge, NFL players to ever come out of East Meadow High School, both ended up going to Penn State. Both were coached by Joe Paterno, and both had the first name Rich.
Well, you have two Dans that are from New York that host a sports law podcast. So we're in the same universe of weird coincidences. But Rich, an absolute pleasure to have you on. You were fantastic, and I hope to have you back on again soon.
Sounds really good, Dan. Anytime.
So that was Rich Ohrnberger. You can find him on Twitter at Ohrnberger, Ohrnberger. So yeah, I mean, Rich was fantastic. I could have talked to Rich for a lot longer, and it's funny. We had both of these conversations. Dan was supposed to speak to Jim for a lot less than he did, and I was supposed to speak to Rich for a lot less than I did. But yeah, these conversations, I mean, we could talk about this stuff for days, and there's just so much history in football. And football is this giant revenue generator. And as Rich and I got into, it's like sometimes the economics of the sport outweigh, and they shouldn't, but you just kind of proofs in the pudding, like they outweigh these personal safety issues. And Jim Quinn was at the forefront of this for many years, advocating for players' rights, advocating for players to get paid more money if they're going to be going to war, and then playing and putting their bodies on the line each and every Sunday. So yeah, again, I said at the top of the show, I'm really thrilled with the guest that we got for this episode. I think two perfect people to speak about player rights, player safety issues. And that's always going to be at the forefront of a show. We deal with sports law issues. So I'm happy we got Rich. And I thought, Rich and Jim were both fantastic guests in their own right. So yeah, this episode's gone on long enough. Maybe I'll give one brief recommendation as we do a what to watch for. We try to do it each and every week. We'll say that this what to watch for segment is sponsored by Better Edge. Better Edge is our gambling partner. Head to Better Edge and use our promo code CONDUCT to get $20 for free over there. And again, is peer-to-peer betting, something very fun. And they have a little bit of different lines than maybe your other sites might have, because people like me, people like you are setting the line. It's very interesting. So definitely check it out if you're into the betting space, as I know many of you are. I am, and I do my betting over at Better Edge. So definitely head over there. So our what to watch for this week. Listen, I watch all things sports and law. I'm not going to lie. I legitimately watch any sports documentary that I get my hands on. I watched a really interesting one this past week. You guys are never going to think I'm going to recommend this, but it was actually surprisingly good. It was a documentary on Netflix, as in their Untold series. It was about the New York Yacht Club in the America's Cup race. I am not a yacht club person. Maybe that would surprise somebody. I have never been on a yacht or watched a yacht race, but this was the upset of Australia upsetting America in the America's Cup Yacht Club race. The United States had won the race for 132 consecutive years. And all of a sudden, Australia, with a very unique design of their boat, took over. Some sports law issues. There was a threatened lawsuit between the New York Yacht Club and the Australian Yacht Club if the design of their boat was illegal. If Australians hadn't designed the boat, I think it was like some other country, maybe it was Norway or some other country who allegedly designed the boat. There's always sports law on these shows, but yeah, if you're looking for something different and you just like a good story, this ESPN, the Untold series on Netflix is fantastic. And I watch basically every ESPN 30 for 30 that comes out. So yeah, but I've watched a lot of them. And I did think that this America's Cup race was very unique and just a very interesting story that I've never heard anything about. So yeah, and that is my what to watch for, sponsored by Better Edge. Again, use our promo code CONDUCT. Get $20 for free. What better advertisement could we give? We're going to have another episode this week. We're going to talk some non-football stories, some collegiate sports stories, maybe even a sport that we have never discussed on the show before. No spoilers. For myself, for Dan Lust, for Rich Ohrnberger, for Jim Quinn, the entire Conduct Detrimental family, We will see you next time on another episode of Kind of Detrimental.